On April 9, 2024, the United States Treasury Department issued its 47th round of sanctions against Iran's missile procurement networks. The statement from the Treasury's Office of Foreign Assets Control named 17 individuals, 11 shell companies across 5 countries, and 3 procurement front offices operating out of Kuala Lumpur and Istanbul. The language was confident. The message was deliberate. America's economic pressure campaign was, in the words of the Deputy Secretary of the Treasury, systematically dismantling Iran's ability to acquire the components it needs to sustain and advance its ballistic missile program. Hold on to that phrase. Systematically dismantling. Vicky, so, sasantoy. Hold on to it for the next 20 minutes, because 6 months later, in October 2024, Iran launched approximately 180 ballistic missiles at Israel in a single coordinated salvo. Not Chinese source, not Russian-assisted. Iranian-designed, Iranian-manufactured, Iranian-launched. The kill chain from engineering lab to launch pad was entirely domestic. The guidance systems were Iranian. The solid fuel propulsion chambers were Iranian. The re-entry vehicles were Iranian. The engineers who designed every component were Iranian-trained, Iranian-educated, and Iranian-employed. These two things cannot both be true at the same time. Either the 47th sanctions package was systematically dismantling Iran's missile capacity, or Iran was producing and testing ballistic missiles at a pace and a precision level that made the 47th sanctions package not just ineffective, but operationally irrelevant. Today, in the next 28 minutes, you are going to find out which one is the lie. And more importantly, you are going to understand why the answer to that question changes everything you think you know about how economic pressure as a foreign policy instrument actually works in the modern world. Right now, the conversation in Washington is circling around one question. Were the sanctions effective enough? CNN is running segments on whether the packages should have targeted more senior procurement officials. Fox is arguing the sanctions should have been applied earlier in the program's development cycle. The BBC is asking whether European partners undermined enforcement through continued commercial banking relationships with designated entities. Every one of those conversations is the wrong conversation. They all share the same foundational assumption, that the goal of sanctions was to stop Iran's missile program, and the only variable worth debating is whether the application was tight enough. But what if the real function of sustained sanctions after a critical threshold is passed is not to stop the program? What if it is to make the program invisible while simultaneously accelerating the development of a version of that program that is structurally immune to the very mechanism being used against it? That is the question. And the framework that answers it is one of the most consistently overlooked mechanisms in international security, with a track record going back to the 1920s. And it is going to change the way you read every sanctions headline you encounter for the rest of your life. The framework is called the embargo graduation effect. Let me explain it from first principles, because the name is straightforward, but the mechanism is counterintuitive. And understanding the mechanism is everything. When a technologically ambitious state is placed under a sustained import embargo on the components its weapons program requires, one of 2 developmental paths becomes available. The first path, the state lacks the domestic human capital, the university infrastructure, the industrial base, and the institutional culture to substitute those components through indigenous production. In this scenario, the embargo succeeds. The program slows, stalls, or degrades over time as existing inventory is depleted and cannot be replenished. This is the path that sanctions designers assume they are enforcing. The second path is the one that history keeps producing, and that policy frameworks keep failing to account for. The state possesses sufficient engineering talent, sufficient educational infrastructure, and sufficient institutional commitment to the program's objectives, and is therefore forced by the systematic closure of import channels to build a domestic production ecosystem. Not just a workaround, not just a substitution for a single component. A complete vertically integrated, domestically self-sufficient industrial and educational system that, once built and once staffed by a trained workforce, is structurally more resilient than the import-dependent model it replaced. Think about what that means. A program that depends on imports has an attack surface you can identify and target. You can sanction the European gyroscope manufacturer. You can intercept the shipping container from the South Korean steel supplier. You can coerce the Turkish intermediary who manages the procurement front company. The attack surface is the supply chain, and the supply chain is visible. A program that has been forced by 10 or 15 years of sustained embargo to internalize every stage of production has no supply chain to attack. The embargo taught the state to manufacture its own capability entirely within its own borders, entirely within its own workforce, entirely outside the reach of the mechanism being used against it. The embargo, in the second scenario, does not weaken the program. It graduates it. It produces a version of the program that is immune to the pressure that created it, okay? The historical anchor for this is not Iran, and it is not even a regime we think of primarily as a proliferation case. The anchor is Germany between 1919 and 1935. When the Treaty of Versailles imposed comprehensive restrictions on German military development in 1919, the Allied architects of those restrictions made a logical but ultimately catastrophic assumption. They assumed that restricting Germany's ability to import weapons, train large armies, and operate prohibited military categories like aircraft and heavy artillery would prevent Germany from developing the capacity to wage another European war within a generation. What happened instead is now well documented in the historical literature, particularly in the work of Williamson Murray at the Marine Corps University and in the archival research of the German military historian Karl-Heinz Frieser. The Versailles restrictions forced the German military establishment to do something that Allied planners had never anticipated and could not monitor through the available intelligence mechanisms of the 1920s. They created a systematic, clandestine engineering education pipeline, embedding military doctrine and technical weapons training inside civilian technical universities and private industrial research organizations. Thousands of German engineers received foundational training in aeronautics, propulsion, ballistics, and military vehicle design under purely civilian institutional cover. The program was not visible because it was not organized as a military program. It was organized as an engineering education program, which is the one category that neither the Versailles framework nor Allied intelligence services were equipped to monitor or restrict. By the time Adolf Hitler publicly repudiated Versailles in March 1935, Germany did not need to rebuild a weapons program. The program had been running continuously for 16 years. It now had a generation of fully trained, domestically educated, domestically employed engineers who would never once need to import the skills that built German military capability. The embargo had not suppressed German rearmament. It had metabolized it into something invisible to Allied intelligence until it was already mature, operational, and structurally self-sustaining. That is the embargo graduation effect. The sanction does not kill the program. The sanction graduates the program into a form the sanction cannot reach. Now apply that framework to Iran. There are 5 pieces of evidence, each more significant than the last, and they build on each other. Number 1, the Iranian Defense Engineering University Corridor and what it produced between 2006 and 2022. In 2006, as the first serious international sanctions pressure was building around Iran's nuclear and missile programs, the Iranian Ministry of Defense and the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps jointly restructured the curriculum and research priorities at 6 major technical universities. The restructuring was most extensive at Shahid Chamran University in Avaz, Sharif University of Technology in Tehran, and Iran University of Science and Technology, also in Tehran. On paper, the changes read as straightforward expansions of aerospace engineering departments, materials science programs, and applied physics faculties. New laboratories were announced. New faculty positions were created. New graduate research programs were established. None of it announced itself as a military development pipeline. According to research published by the International Institute for Strategic Studies in London and corroborated by independent analysis from the Royal United Services Institute and the Washington-based Center for Strategic and International Studies, what Iran built during this period was a 16-year engineering education pipeline, not a procurement pipeline, an education pipeline. The specific objective, documented in Iranian government budget documents and Defense Ministry organizational charts, obtained by investigative journalists at Reuters and the Financial Times between 2018 and 2022, was to produce graduates capable of designing, testing, manufacturing, and quality controlling guidance systems, solid fuel propulsion chambers, and re-entry vehicle structures without reference to any imported component and without dependence on any foreign technical assistance. Let me make that concrete, because the abstraction buries the significance. The international sanctions regime in 2006 was specifically targeting Iran's ability to purchase ring laser gyroscopes from European manufacturers. Gyroscopes are the core component of an inertial navigation system. And an inertial navigation system is what tells a ballistic missile where it is and where it is going. Without a reliable gyroscope, a ballistic missile becomes an unguided rocket. The entire precision architecture of a modern missile program depends on gyroscope quality. So the sanctions were targeting gyroscopes. They were the attack surface. They were the logical point of interdiction. Iran looked at that attack surface and made a decision not to protect the supply chain, not to find alternate gyroscope suppliers, though that continued in parallel, but to teach Iranian engineers to design and manufacture gyroscopes that did not need to be purchased from anyone. At Sharif University of Technology, by 2015, according to academic publication records and patent filings reviewed by IISS analysts, Iranian graduate students and faculty were producing peer-reviewed research on ring laser gyroscope design and solid-state inertial sensor fabrication, not theoretical research, applied research with prototype testing. The sanctions closed the import door. Iran spent 9 years building a manufacturing capability that made the import door irrelevant. Does that make sense? Number 2, the JCPOA negotiating period and the strategic decision that was made inside it that no Western analysis ever adequately examined. Between 2013 and 2015, when the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action was being negotiated between Iran and the P5+1, the international community's analytical attention was almost entirely focused on the nuclear file. Centrifuge counts, enrichment percentages, the Iraq heavy water reactors design specifications. The Fordo facility's underground hardening. These were the variables that occupied the negotiating teams, the verification mechanisms, and the international media. The conventional missile program was explicitly excluded from the JCPOA framework. Iran's lead negotiator, Mohammad Javad Zarif, insisted on that exclusion in multiple documented negotiating sessions, and the Obama administration, having concluded that the nuclear file represented the existential threat requiring resolution, the policy logic was not unreasonable in isolation. The nuclear file was the higher order threat. Getting agreement on it required accepting Iranian preconditions on the missile file. What the American side did not process was the second-order effect of that sequencing decision. By excluding the missile program from the verification framework, the JCPOA created a legal and diplomatic environment in which Iran could simultaneously receive partial sanctions relief on oil revenue, which the deal provided, and continue the defense engineering education pipeline without any mechanism for international monitoring or constraint. And here's the more precise version of the error. The JCPOA years, 2015 through 2018, were the period during which the first cohort of graduates from the post-2006 defense engineering pipeline were completing their doctoral programs and entering the workforce of the Aerospace Industries Organization and the IRGC's missile development units. The timing was not coincidental. The education investment made in 2006 in direct response to sanctions pressure produced its first generation of fully trained domestic engineers precisely during the window when international monitoring was most relaxed and when Iranian oil revenue was partially restored. The sanctions that were supposed to prevent the capability funded the education pipeline. The diplomatic engagement that was supposed to constrain the program created the breathing space in which the first generation of domestically trained engineers moved from university laboratory to operational weapons development. These were not separate events. They were the embargo graduation effect completing its cycle. Number 3, the Fateh 313, the DESFUL, and what the October 2024 test data actually proved. In August 2019, Iran publicly displayed and conducted a test launch of the DESFUL, an upgraded variant of the Fateh-class short-range ballistic missile family, claiming a range of 1,000 kilometers and a circular error probable of approximately 8 meters. Let me translate that into accessible terms. Circular error probable is the radius within which 50% of the warheads fired at a given target will land. 8 meters circular error probable means that half of all missiles fired at a specific coordinate will land within 8 meters of that coordinate. That is roughly the footprint of a large military vehicle or a small hardened shelter. That is precision that converts a ballistic missile from an area effect weapon into a point effect weapon. Western analysts in 2019 disputed those specifications, and that skepticism was entirely reasonable. Iran had historically overstated weapons performance in public presentations, and without independent verification, claimed precision figures are just numbers on a slide. 8 meters was dismissed in most Western analytical assessments as an aspirational figure rather than a demonstrated capability. October 2024 removed the ambiguity. During the Iranian ballistic missile salvo against Israel, the pattern of impact points, documented by the Israel Defense Forces spokesperson's unit, independently verified by open-source intelligence analysts at Bellingcat and the Conflict Monitoring Project ACLED, and reported by the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal, confirmed that a significant subset of the missiles that penetrated Israeli and American active defenses achieved terminal guidance accuracy consistent with the DESFUL program's stated specifications. Some impacts were documented within meters of intended aim points. Not all missiles performed at that level. A number were intercepted, a number failed in flight, and the active defense performance of Israeli Iron Dome, David's Sling, and American THAAD batteries was real and significant. But enough missiles demonstrated precision that the 8-meter claim, dismissed as propaganda in 2019, required retrospective reassessment as either accurate or close to accurate. Now translate that precision figure into engineering terms, because the engineering implication is the critical one. Achieving single-digit circular error probable on a ballistic missile traveling at several kilometers per second through atmospheric re-entry requires domestic mastery of 3 specific technologies. Inertial navigation systems capable of maintaining orientation through the re-entry environment, terminal guidance seekers that can update the flight path during the final approach phase, and re-entry vehicle structures capable of controlled maneuvering at hypersonic speeds. All 3 of those technologies were on the sanctions control lists. All 3 were specifically targeted by the export control mechanisms that 47 rounds of sanctions packages were designed to enforce. Iran demonstrated all 3 without imported components, produced by the engineers the sanctions inadvertently trained. Okay? Number 4, the generational handoff at the Aerospace Industries Organization, and why it makes the next 20 years structurally different from the last 20. The Aerospace Industries Organization, the AIO, is the Iranian state body that manages the development of strategic missile systems. It sits under the Ministry of Defense and Armed Forces Logistics, and its senior technical leadership determines the direction and pace of Iran's missile program. What matters for this analysis is not the organization's current capability at a snapshot in time. What matters is its demographic structure, because demographic structure is how you understand capability trajectories, rather than capability states. According to biographical data compiled by the Foundation for Defense of Democracies and cross-referenced against Iranian state media coverage of defense sector appointments, industry publications from organizations like the AIO's own journal, and the academic publication records of individuals later identified in defense sector roles, the senior engineering leadership of Iran's missile program as of 2024 is dominated by individuals who completed their primary technical education between 2004 and 2016. Not the generation that was trained before the sanctions pressure intensified. The generation that was trained during the sanctions pressure. The generation that grew up in a technical education environment specifically restructured in response to sanctions, where designing without imported components was not a constraint to be worked around, but a foundational engineering discipline taught from the first year of the undergraduate curriculum. This is the generational handoff that the title of today's analysis names. Washington's sanctions policy was, at its most optimistic, designed to attrit the existing generation of Iranian missile engineers through component denial and the general economic pressure of comprehensive sanctions. It is entirely possible that it succeeded in slowing that generation's work at the margins. It is completely irrelevant because simultaneously, the same pressure that was supposed to attrit the existing generation was producing the conditions that drove the creation of a new generation that had never known a world where importing worked. A generation that is, structurally and by design, immune to the sanctions that shape them. Think about that precisely. You cannot sanction away a capability that was born inside your own sanction regime. The capability was not created despite the sanctions. It was created by the sanctions as a direct response to them, under conditions that the sanctions themselves established. The 40th, 41st, 42nd round of sanctions packages were not targeting an Iranian missile program. They were targeting a version of that program that had already been graduated into a form those packages could not reach. Number 5, the cost structure of the domestic production base and why it makes the strategic arithmetic worse going forward, not better. Every episode on this channel returns to the cost ratio because the cost ratio is where abstract strategic analysis becomes concrete operational reality. In the missile domain, the relevant cost ratio is not the $50,000 drone versus the $4 million interceptor, a symmetry that governs the drone warfare theaters. In the missile domain, the cost ratio that matters is the unit production cost of the missile itself, before and after the embargo graduation effect completes. Court records from German export control violation cases prosecuted between 2008 and 2014, cases involving German nationals charged with attempting to supply controlled components to Iranian procurement networks, established that a single European-manufactured ring laser gyroscope, the type Iran was trying to import before the sanctions made that impossible, carried a unit cost on the black market of between $40,000 and $90,000. That is the cost of one guidance component for one missile. When Iran was import dependent, that figure set a floor on per unit missile production, cost that constrained how many missiles Iran could afford to build and stockpile. A domestically manufactured gyroscope equivalent, once the production infrastructure is established, the workforce is trained, and the production line is running at volume, has a marginal cost structure that is dramatically lower. The first domestically produced gyroscope is expensive. It carries the amortized cost of the entire education system, the research program, the prototype testing, and the production line establishment. The 5th is cheaper, the 50th is cheaper still. The 500th is produced at a marginal cost that the import-dependent model could not approach. This is basic economics of scale applied to weapons production, and it means that the cost constraint on Iran's missile production volume has been eliminated, not by better procurement, but by the domestic industrialization that the sanctions themselves forced. The choke point has moved. It used to be the supply chain, which was visible, targetable, and sanctionable. Now it is domestic manufacturing capacity, which cannot be sanctioned by an external actor and which is currently expanding, not contracting. Now let the strongest argument against this analysis be heard, because a framework that cannot survive its best counter-argument is not worth your time. The counter-argument runs like this. The October 2024 missile salvo, while tactically impressive in volume, was operationally degraded.